Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you one of the best tournament games that I think I have ever played. I just got back from this tournament a few days ago, and as I was analyzing, I was kind of surprised and delighted to find that this game, the game graph was like a completely flat line, which is surprising to me because usually my games are like a complete roller coaster. Basically, that just means that I played very accurately in this game, and so did my opponent. It's a very strategic, maneuvering game, and while there are not a lot of tactical fireworks, that doesn't mean that it is any less exciting. So, if you're looking to learn how to play some of these slower, more maneuvering games, this will be a good lesson for you. Or if you just want to enjoy the chess, happy to have you here as well. So, I'll give you some insight into my thought process as we walk through this game, but just for some context, this was the final round in a 5-round classical tournament that I played over the course of 2 days. I had traveled about 8 hours to get to this tournament, and so between the travel and the hours of chess games, I was pretty exhausted by this point. My previous round game had finished up a bit early, so I had about an hour to prep for this one, but we didn't get our pairings until like basically right before the round started. I kind of did the math to see who I would get paired against, and because I'd had black the previous round, I thought I was going to have the white pieces, so I was studying my white opening, and then when the pairings came out, I saw that I was paired with the highest seed in the section, and I had the black pieces, and so all of my prep went out the window, and I was like, well, you know what, it's the last round, let's just go have some fun. So my opponent actually opened with 1c4, which is the English opening. If you're not really prepared against the English, this kind of thing can be kind of intimidating. I mean, anything that's not like e4 or d4 can kind of throw your opponent off guard. But as somebody playing the black pieces, you have to have that kind of confidence not to tell your opponent with your body language that you are thrown off guard. I'm personally fine with playing against the English. I mostly just like to sort of try and transpose into some kind of a more familiar pawn structure. For me, that is kind of the semi-Slav or the Queen's Gambit declined type of pawn structure. So I started with e6. So now my opponent goes for this typical plan of pushing g3 and wanting to fianchetto this bishop and have a nice control of this long diagonal. And then my idea as black is to shut that bishop down as much as possible with the pawn structure. So I want to play moves like c6 and d5. If this pawn ever gets captured, I will recapture and still use the pawn structure itself to prevent white's bishop from having the long range that it wants to have. So continuing building out my position with developing a piece, knight f6, white fianchettos the bishop, and now, okay, I push in the center, d5. If white captures, I would of course capture back with the pawn, and then continue to build that up with the c6 pawn, which is what I do right on the next move. White castles, and I bring my bishop out. Slightly more accurate here, and I think one of the better book moves is bringing the knight out, because you pretty much know that your knight wants to go there, whereas there might be situations where your bishop doesn't necessarily want to land on the d6 square. You might want to put it here if, this bishop comes out and pins your knight. You might want to put it here and go after this knight if it comes out. So this doesn't give you as much flexibility, but it's still a, perfectly fine move. And now my opponent plays d4, and now we're in, I guess, like a Catalan. Okay, the chess.com opening thing says English opening, Neo-Catalan, semi-Slav defense. So whatever that is. So I brought my knight out, and white decided to fianchetto their bishop the other way as well, so they're going to have these two snipers crisscrossing across the entire board. This move also is defending their c-pawn, which I guess at this point I may have been threatening to take. I did consider this move in the game. The reason I decided not to play it, even though, this pawn has been free for the taking for several moves now, is you typically don't want to give up one of your central pawns for one of your opponent's side pawns. So at this point I castled, and white made kind of a strange move, moving this knight back. And the reason I'm calling it strange, and I thought so in the game as well, is that they've already moved their knight once. They still have these two minor pieces on the back rank, and so moving that knight again, especially to a place where I thought this knight might want to go, seemed a little odd to me. It turned out to be pretty good placement for that knight just because it was controlling the c4 square, and I suppose it opens up for this bishop as well. Oh, you know what? Probably the idea was something like e4, but then why not bring this other knight out? I'm not really sure. So because this knight had moved away from looking at this e5 square, I took this opportunity to break in the center with the move e5 myself because white was not making any threats against me. Pushing pawns is, especially in the center, and especially when you're offering your opponent a trade of pawns, this is something that should not be taken lightly. And I thought about this move, I think, for quite a while. It was something that had been in the back of my mind. I want to move either the e pawn or the c pawn at some point just to give my light scored bishop a little bit more scope. Because at this point, this is my worst piece on the board. And so after this pawn moves out of its way, it's going to have more scope to come out, do things like this, maybe trade off for my opponent's much stronger light scored bishop. So this seems like a good time to break open the center, make this pawn break. So now we have a pawn trade in the center. White captures on d5, and I captured back with the knight, which was probably my biggest inaccuracy in the game. And my thought process here was I actually don't want to recapture with the pawn because it's going to give me eventually an isolated queen's pawn. It won't have any pawn buddies next to it, and I'm going to have to use my pieces to defend that pawn that's all on its lonesome, which is why I took with the knight because, of course, white can take, but I figured this was pretty unlikely that they would want to give up their very strong light squared bishop for just my knight because it's removing a defender of the light squares around the king, and it's also just a very good attacking piece in this position that is slowly opening up. So I figured that was probably not going to happen, so I retain my little pawn island over here rather than isolating one on the d5 square. So what I missed here was that, okay, I capture back with the pawn, so if white were to play a strong move like, okay, e4 is their strongest move, I think that is actually pretty unlikely. I would consider something more like the plan that they were already going for, which is bringing the bishop out. Now I get to just push this pawn forward, forget about trading pawns in the center. I've got this extremely strong pawn center that white's bishop is just bashing its head against. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, I captured with my knight, and white continued by bringing their knight down to the c4 square. So I guess their plan was, okay, they want to capture here with the pawn anyway, free up that square for their knight to do this exciting reroute and go after my bishop. I guess that might have been the plan. If not, that's what became the plan, and I had to move my bishop back. So my opponent has plenty of time to develop his other pieces, bringing that bishop to the b2 square as anticipated, and I took this opportunity to capture and relieve this tension between the pawns in the center. White did indeed capture back with the queen, now teaming up with the bishop to threaten this battery checkmate against my king. I needed to make sure I was going to be able to defend against this. So I will say a lot of this game was very much about prophylaxis and sort of trying to predict what my opponent wanted to do. And I think the same thing from the other side, sort of trying to slowly maneuver pieces in a way that was both making threats, but also going to be able to defend against my opponent's threats. So in this position, I blocked the path of the queen with my knight, and now white develops his final piece, bringing the knight out to c3, also cutting off communication with this move between the bishop and the queen. So checkmate is no longer an immediate threat, but it could be a future discovered threat, which is why I wanted to get the queens off the board as soon as possible. I figured if I could get this into some kind of a minor piece endgame, it would be a little bit easier for me to figure out things to do and hold a draw at the very least, because at this point, white's queen is much more active than mine. And so this is why I didn't capture this knight with my knight. Instead, I moved my knight back, opening up this path for the queens to be looking at each other. And I calculated this, if I'd captured this, this would allow the queen to capture and move off of the same file as my queen, staying on the board, which is not what I wanted. My idea at this point, again, was to get the queens off the board. So by moving the knight out of the way, other than bringing a rook to the center to defend the queen, probably the best option was to just capture it. So I did capture with the rook. One thing I was considering around this time was whether or not my opponent was going to try and double my pawns. If we get into just a king and pawn endgame, which seemed like that may be where we were heading. Me having doubled pawns would be a weakness if all else was equal. I wasn't sure if my opponent was going to be able to trade off all of the minor pieces or even trade off to everything but, just bishops for each side. But in the case that this knight moves, then my opponent would be immediately threatening to take this knight and double my pawns because I don't have another piece defending that knight. I could move the knight. There's not a reason to leave it there to have the pawns doubled, and I don't even know if my opponent would actually go for that because it would be giving up the bishop pair, and in at least the current position and even in a few moves, there's not a very easy way to force trades of all the rest of the minor pieces. So as long as you have minor pieces on the board, there's always crazy chances for things in endgames. All that being said, these are the kind of long-term strategic things that I was thinking about. Okay, is my opponent going to try and double my pawns on this side or try and double my pawns on this side? So the game continued with my opponent capturing my knight on b6, and I continued with capturing with my bishop. So now there's one open file on the board. It's the d file, and I have a rook there and my opponent doesn't. So they want to try and fight for control over that open file, bringing one of their rooks to the center. I do not trade. Instead, I develop my final piece off of its starting square. So now, of course, if white takes, I will retain control of that open file. This is also, of course, looking at this pawn, so it can't move forward because, okay, then I'm going to take the rook behind it. And this knight also shouldn't probably move away because then I'm just going to win the pawn. That's the only defender it has right now. So instead, my opponent kicked my bishop away. I brought it back to e6, just having a little anchor here with the f7 pawn. So my opponent played e3, just putting, a little bit more pawn space in between my bishop and his king. And I decided to initiate the rook trades, going with the capturing on d1 and then bringing the other rook into the center. My opponent captured, and after I recapture with the bishop, we have this position, which I would consider like the start of the endgame. Okay, we're down to just 6 pawns each. It's kind of an interesting endgame because we both still have 3 minor pieces left on the board, so there's still, I would say, quite a bit of chess to play. But the problem is neither side can really make that much progress because there are still so many pawns on the board, and the difference is primarily in the pawn structure, meaning that I have a 3-on-2 on this side, and my opponent has a 4-on-3 on the other side. And then also important is the piece placement, and I would actually consider white's pieces to be in slightly better positions here. Their fianchettoed bishops actually have a lot more scope than my bishops do, and at this point I don't actually want to jump my knight into the center to initiate even more trades because just to imagine, this would eventually lead to me having this isolated pawn in the center, which I wasn't entirely sure that I could defend. The engine is saying everything is like completely equal here. Like I can, just move my king around in circles and it's going to be fine. But from a human perspective, you would rather have your pawn holding hands with its buddies over here than all alone in the center of the board. So both of us started moving our kings to the center. This is what you should do when it is the end game. And now we're still looking at prophylaxis. So things I was thinking about here in this position. Is there any way I can give a check? Well, no, the pawns are kind of preventing my bishop from ever getting close to my opponent's king, which is at this point staying on the light squares. My opponent, on the other hand, always had this option of checking on a3, at least at this point when, my king is on that dark square. So I always have to be thinking, okay, what if that check comes? Can I move to a place where I'm not going to get checked again, possibly by the knight? Am I going to be leaving any pieces or pawns undefended if I have to move off of the dark diagonal? So now my opponent makes this very committal e4 move, which I think the plan looks pretty simple here, wanting to push forward with e5 and kick my knight away. And my knight does not really have a lot of good squares to go. I thought about this for quite a long time because if I want to move here, then suddenly this bishop check becomes a lot more a devastating move because I'm going to have to move back to the 8th rank. You want your king as close as possible to the center, and this was going to be my escape square, so I don't really want to put my knight there when it eventually gets kicked away. So I cemented all my pawns on the light squares, and after my opponent played this expected move of e5, I decided to bring my knight all the way back to the 8th rank, and now my two minor pieces back here look pretty passive. And in this position, my evaluation was that I was probably slightly worse. I wasn't sure exactly how much worse. Looking at the evaluation, it's not that bad. I don't think it's as bad as I thought it was because white just can't really make any progress. Sure, they can continue to sort of gain space and even bring their king all the way up to the center here, but beyond that, it's actually going to be pretty difficult for him to actually continue to push forward without making concessions in his own position. But again, you don't know that when you're actually playing the game, and having two pieces on the back rank in the end game seems pretty bad. So now my opponent jumps his knight into the center, and suddenly there are actually some very real threats. My opponent suddenly has all of these options for where that knight can go forward, trying to either win a pawn or go after my light squared bishop, which is a crucial piece in this position because all of my pawns, except this one, are on the light squares, and I need that piece around to defend my light squares. Additionally, because the position is most likely eventually going to open up, we're probably closer to that than not, having the bishop pair for my opponent would probably be a pretty strong advantage just because the bishops are those long-range pieces and they can control so many more squares on the board than just a knight can, especially a knight that's stuck on the d8 square, or excuse me, the e8 square. So I had to be precise here, and the move that I chose was actually to pin my opponent's knight to their bishop. I thought about bringing my bishop out to b6 so that if the knight were to ever go to c5, I would be able to snag it, but the reason I disregarded that was, what if this check comes first? Okay, then I have to move my king to a light square, then the knight comes in with check, and I'm either losing, if my bishop's here, I'm either losing the dark squared bishop by capturing the knight, or I'm moving my king and my opponent gets to take my light squared bishop. So in either case, I had calculated that I was probably going to be losing a bishop. I also could not prevent the knight from coming here with pushing a pawn, because then my opponent would be able to play knight g5. So looking at the bishop, looking at the pawn, and then also since that pawn had moved forward, the bishop is suddenly looking at the c pawn. So just everything is hanging, and it just didn't look very good. So bishop d5 seemed to buy me a little bit of time. My opponent continued solidifying the center with pawns, and at this point, my thought was, okay, I probably need to be kind of quick if I want to try and work my pawns up this side of the board, going for some pawn breaks and, again, trying to get a passed pawn that my opponent's going to have to worry about. So now my opponent plays bishop f3, probably looking at things like bishop to g4, just giving that bishop a little bit more scope, so I wanted to prevent that. I played the move h5. My opponent moved the king up, now defending both of these pieces, so that now, this bishop would be able to move somewhere else, or the knight could move out of the way and the bishop would be defended. So just kind of consolidating everything so that this pin is no longer quite as strong. And now my idea is I want to give my pieces a little bit more scope. So I need to move my king out of the way so that my bishop is going to be able to cover these dark squares where the knight would like to go. Additionally, I want to get my knight more involved in the game, ideally jumping up to a square like f5. Like in this position, if my knight was on f5, that would be fantastic. Okay, moved my king out of the way. That's step one. And now my opponent finally brought their bishop to a3, just one move too late to actually give the check. I moved my king out of the way a little too soon. And I decided to offer the bishop trade. So my opponent captured my bishop, and then in this position, we agreed to a draw. So obviously, there's still a lot of pieces left on the board, pieces and pawns, and we could have played this out. I think in some cases it's even worth playing positions like this out, but last round of the tournament, it was either going to be just a completely stupid liquidated king pawn endgame, or it was going to be a very complex one where maybe the minor pieces stayed on the board, and we just kind of had to grind out this really grimy maneuvering endgame, which I just don't think either of us were interested in doing. So as you can see throughout the game, neither of us really had opportunities to create some crazy tactical attacking lines. It was very much a solid game from the very beginning, and the challenge really came from having the patience to think, multiple moves in advance and even think of very much more long-term plans, not even really concretely, but kind of ideal pawn structures and ideal like piece trays that you would like to have, because in these kinds of games, the little mistakes can really add up, and especially once you liquidate to an end game like this, if you make like strategic mistakes earlier in the game, those will come back to bite you much later in the game, like in these kinds of positions. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my perfect game of chess. If you're new around here, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you soon.